Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so our screencast for today is going to focus on the home front during World War II, and really we're going to focus on American production and a lot of the sacrifices that Americans make in order to be successful and to win World War II. So really a lot of this is going to tie back to a major idea that we have to kind of understand economically. So World War II in a lot of ways sets up something known as the military-industrial complex. Now, we have to kind of understand, like, what exactly does that mean? Well, really what this means in very simplified terms is that during World War II, our economic, I guess, success and growth as a country is tied to our military endeavors overseas. So we have to expand the military and we have to produce for the military at an incredible rate. Because not only are we supplying our troops, but we're also trying to supply a lot of our allies in World War II as well. And so really what gets us out of the Great Depression is the production from World War II. It's all of the jobs created, all of the government contracts given out to American industry, all of the spending done during World War II that catapults us out of the Great Depression. But paradoxically, what it does is it ties some of our economic growth to military expansion and military growth. So that's an important concept just to understand, and this is known as the military-industrial complex. And you want to understand that our industry in certain ways becomes tied to our military and what's happening overseas, and this allows America to flourish economically during the war, but it also kind of connects our certain aspects of our industrial development to our military after the war. Now, how do we actually produce during World War II? So later in the week, we're going to talk about the battles of World War II and our GIs overseas and what they're doing in order to be successful and to defeat Nazi Germany in Europe and fascist Italy and imperialist Japan in the Pacific. What's happening at home? So who is kind of taking the jobs at home and who is responsible for this increased production and this massive industrial production that's happening in the United States? So largely it's women. So what you want to understand here is in America, during wartime, really we have a dichotomy of labor. So I want you guys to write that term down, this idea of a dichotomy of labor based off of gender, really. And so like a lot of men are going overseas to fight in the war, and a lot of women are moving into take on these industrial jobs. Now what you're looking at here is a famous character that's kind of created during World War II, propaganda character known as Rosie the Riveter. And when you look at Rosie the Riveter here, she's she's holding a rivet gun right here, which is traditionally a male occupied profession. Now, women are kind of moving into jobs that are predominantly used to be held by men, are considered like heavy industry jobs, not really feminine jobs. And they're kind of moving into these things, and the government is trying to convince women that, like, this is important, you must take on this role. So if you look at this propaganda poster from, World War II, Rosie the Riveter kind of mixes aspects of masculine and feminine ideas here. Everything from the way that her hair is done, to her lipstick, to, like her biceps looking strong. Like all these things are supposed to kind of send dual messages to women that, like, yes, you have to go and do these industrial jobs, but you can retain kind of like your feminine identity at the same time. So it's kind of an interesting mix here. So women overwhelmingly answer the call to go into industry and to kind of serve their country on the home front by producing and taking on these industrial jobs. And a lot of these women are women who have never had jobs while they were married. A lot of them are married women who are going out for the first time and taking industrial jobs. And a lot of them are doing it for the patriotic duty of kind of serving your country in its time of need. And so this is an important thing to understand. So a lot of our industrial capacity is we're able to kind of come through and achieve this because of the women who are kind of taking these jobs while the men are overseas, fighting in World War II. Now, to give you an idea of American production, we are an industrial powerhouse at the time. We make a lot of our own products for ourselves. And you can really see this during World War II, how quickly we can build up our military. So I want you guys to take a look at our increases of production from 1941 to 1942. They're absolutely incredible. The amount of ships that they're cranking out, the tanks that they're cranking out, the airplanes. And this isn't a matter of a year from the attack on Pearl Harbor until, the same time the next year by 1942. So American production is just incredible. And when you look at it compared to our enemies, you get a better idea of just how much we're able to produce. We had, for every one Japanese warship created, we created 16. Our GDP during the war is 1.4 trillion compared to all of our enemies combined is 650 billion. So you get an idea here of what a huge advantage our industrial complex in America is, because this gives America a huge edge up on a lot of our enemies that we're fighting against, and it gives us the ability to help our allies at the same time. We are a major production powerhouse of the time period. And this is an industrial war. This is a full-scale industrial mass production war. And America can out-mass produce a lot of these other countries out there at the time. Now, big thing you have to ask yourself is, how are we able to do this? Like, what gives us the ability to do this? So when you think about it, it goes back to a concept that we talked about earlier in our class, this idea of Yankee ingenuity. This inventiveness of Americans being able to adapt and to change things on the fly. So what a lot of our industry does is known as retooling for the war. So a lot of our car companies and other kinds of manufacturing, what they do very, very quickly is they're able to reconfigure their factories and retool their factories to go from making domestic products to making war goods, in a matter of months. So right now, currently, there are some factories trying to do this for dealing with the coronavirus epidemic. And they're trying to make respirators. So you have different companies like GE and Ford are trying to kind of retool. So they're taking a page from World War II, and they're kind of taking that same idea that, yeah, we can change over our factory and we can make these things that are now in demand, these respirators that we desperately need. Now, in World War II, the thing is that we just have so much more industrial capacity that they could do it so much quicker, because this is who America is. We are an industrial economy at the time. Right now, we're more of a service economy, so we don't necessarily produce a lot of these products. Same thing with our pharmaceuticals, right? Pharmaceutical drugs are in high demand right now. We don't make a lot of those here in the United States anymore. They're made overseas. And so you kind of see like a difference between 1940s America and modern day America a little bit. So what's going to happen here is the government is going to make contracts with big companies in order to get them to produce products for World War II. So this is very similar to World War I, when they went out and made contracts with companies. And they're going to go to some of the bigger companies out there like Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and get them to produce for the war. And a lot of these companies still have major defense contracts today. So on the one hand, it increases production tremendously for the war, but it also is concentrating power and, I guess, wealth to a large extent into certain companies who get these lucrative government contracts. Now, something that they say about World War II, you may have never heard this before, but sometimes what historians say about it is that it was won with Russian blood and American production. So we just kind of talked about the American production element of it. We are really supplying a lot of the Allies. We're outproducing everybody in the war. The Russian blood component of this, to give you an idea, about 20 million Russians die fighting, or not necessarily fighting, but civilian casualties and military casualties during World War II. The American casualties is much, much fewer, about 350,000 die. So, we're talking about, a major difference between 20 million and 350,000. As far as the blood that goes into the war from the Russian side. So you want to keep that in mind, because the Russians are going to have a different view after World War II than Americans do about dealing with a lot of these different things that happen. Okay, well, we're going to talk about the last part of our screencast is kind of like how Americans made sacrifices during the war. So this was a phrase that they would, that was kind of like used in propaganda: use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. And really was to try to preach to Americans that, you have to make sacrifices. We need you to make sacrifices for the country. And it's your patriotic duty as an American to make these sacrifices. Now, how did they do this? Well, they're trying to convince Americans to do everything from buy war bonds, to limit their food consumption, to limit their oil consumption. And so there's a full kind of propaganda machine out there at the time. And everybody kind of like plays a role in it. So I'm going to show you guys, along with this, some cartoons made by like Walt Disney, and some famous characters like Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse. So not Mickey Mouse, but Bugs Bunny and like Donald Duck, that you're going to see in a different light because they're using them as like tools to try and preach their message of, patriotism during World War II. And so these are just some other ones that you kind of see some propaganda posters trying to tap into people's fear about potentially being invaded and what could happen in the United States. And so Americans are really going to try and make sacrifices for the war. So what I want to talk a little bit about is one of the major ways the government kind of imposed this on Americans was through something called rationing. So during World War II, since the war lasted for such a long time, it lasted for about 4 years for the United States portion of the war, Americans are going to be asked to ration what they consume, what they eat, what they use in all different various forms. So Americans were issued these things called ration books. And essentially they kind of had like these coupons inside, but these coupons kind of designated how many items you were allowed to buy of a certain product. Because a lot of things were going overseas to feed and clothe our soldiers, and Americans were asked to kind of like restrict on the home front in order to, better equip our soldiers overseas. So a lot of things were rationed, everything from meat to butter to all different kind of products that you could get at the supermarket, and also other things were rationed as well. So like, for example, clothing was rationed during the time period, or cloth was rationed during the time period. So like styles got shorter, tighter, simply because they were trying to use less cloth to kind of help for uniforms and different things overseas. Oil was severely rationed because they needed that for fighting the war. And so like it was really kind of limited as far as how much you could use and how much you could drive. So you were kind of issued, depending on your profession, certain number of miles per week. You might be classified as A or B, or depending on how often you needed to drive. And they would kind of like try to convince you, like, do you really need to take this trip? Do you really need to go out? Is this trip really necessary? And they try to get you to kind of like drive under a certain mile per hour to save your tires. So this, I think, should remind you of kind of like some of what we're going through today. Like they're trying to preach similar things, like, should you be going out right now? Do you really need to go to the store right now? And so like it's the same kind of mentality. And in a lot of ways, even though this is not a war, we're kind of in a war mentality, and the government is trying to preach that, collectively we need to make certain sacrifices in order to overcome, our difficulties. And so this is something that during World War II, Americans were able to successfully do. And, everybody tried to answer the call. So you had famous professional athletes like baseball stars joining the military. So this is Joe DiMaggio, famous Yankee from the time period. Bob Feller, another famous, baseball player from the period, and Ted Williams. You had musicians kind of jump in to try and entertain the troops. Everybody from Glenn Miller, who's a famous big band artist. This group, the Andrews Sisters, this is a famous song that they sang called the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B. So like you had all these different people kind of like jumping in to try and help and do what they could for the war. So I think this is a very telling statistic. I'm going to leave you guys with this. So in 1944, they surveyed the American public, and 2/3 of them, now this is 3.5, 4 years into the war, 2/3 of them, 66%, said that they didn't do enough for the war effort, and if the country asked them to sacrifice more, they would have been more than willing to sacrifice more. So I just want you guys to kind of think about that and think about kind of like the character that this generation possessed.